Great. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about action policies um, and how they kind of exist in Monty, looking a bit, kind of covering mostly how they are now, but also looking a bit more towards the future. And it's kind of too much to probably cover just in this meeting. So I plan to talk about kind of the different types of agents we have right now, as well as these kind of two sort of entry-level policies. So utility policies, and then which I'll explain kind of what that is, and then kind of input-driven, sensory-driven policies. And then the next meeting I can talk about these other ones. And then kind of throughout this, I'll try and touch on where relevant kind of abstract space and how that might kind of fit in. And yeah, I mean, really the kind of core aim behind our work on policies, in the kind of short term is really about getting robust and efficient object recognition working, as well as pose recognition. And so we want kind of Monty to act in a principled way, obviously not randomly. And for example, be able to handle things like similar objects, which might be ambiguous, and kind of solve that ambiguity as quickly as possible. And ideally, those decisions should also be arrived at quickly and without kind of huge computational costs. But yeah, as kind of alluded to with the abstract spaces thing, where ultimately Monty is obviously not just about 3D object recognition, and similarly the policies are not just about enabling 3D object recognition. And so while we're working on this, we're also trying to kind of have a view to the longer term aims of Monty and how those will fit in.
Of course, you also you had it grayed out in your previous slide, but perhaps beyond this, it's really using action policies to affect change in the world, right? To bring about goals and things like that. So,
right.
Which is most people would think that's that's what that's why we move, right? As opposed to we move to learn and so let's not forget that. I know you didn't. It was on your previous slide.
Yeah.
You didn't.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring it up.
It's a good way of maybe summarizing kind of the existing policies are really focused on this kind of perceptual element.
Right.
But yeah, in the future, as you say, it's going to be super important kind of how you affect change in the world.
Right. This is sort of like the background stuff we have to get right before we go on and do okay, this thing's going to act in the world.
Right. So first, just kind of briefly a word on kind of Monty agents. I'm going to assume kind of some background awareness of Monty, but whether you're reading the documentation or those who recently joined the team, you'll probably be aware that there's the kind of surface agent and the distant agent, and we kind of have this separation, but you might start wondering what does this separation really mean? Because Monty is of course an artificial system, so if it's implemented in the real world, there's nothing to stop us from putting a camera on a robotic arm. And indeed, kind of the way that the sort of surface agent, the sort of finger, if you will, is implemented at the moment is actually with a depth camera that just maintains a very close distance to an object as it moves across it. And so it can also get color information. So I think it's kind of useful just clarifying really the differences that are kind of fundamental. And I guess the way I'd kind of try and break it down is you can think of the distant agent, obviously think of an eye, and how that moves in space and how that samples information. And of course that can sample very rapidly, through saccades. It can move, from one side of an object to the other side of an object almost instantaneously. And with kind of peripheral vision, for example, you get kind of a broad overview that could, maybe at a coarser level, give you some information about what's out there, and then you can choose to kind of sample that information with higher fidelity, either through kind of focusing the distant agent sensor, the kind of highest resolution sensors on it, like the fovea and the human eye, or perhaps through moving your hand or some other sensor to that location to sample it in more detail.
But you also, with the distant agent, you just get one view of the object. So there's a lot of self-occlusion of the object compared to the surface agent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it has some...
I didn't understand that comment. Could you explain that?
So like if I'm looking at an object, like I just have one angle at it. I can't just move my eye to the other side of the object like I can saccade. I mean, I could move the entire agent to the other side of the object, but the eye can't just like change.
Oh, are you saying that I can move my sensor, if it's like a finger, I can move it around the other side, but when I miss my eye, I have to move the object or move my body.
Yeah, exactly.
But moving my body is just a slower, more cumbersome way of moving your hand, right? It's the same basic idea. I could walk around.
Yeah, and I guess a Monty agent system could have like cameras located around a room or something like that.
Right,
but,
right. Yeah.
But
okay.
But yeah, at least it's more common. I think it's fair to say that self-occlusion is a more frequent problem for a distant agent than.
I just the word self-occlusion confused me.
Just that the object is occluding parts of itself, so you can't just see the backside of the object. Whereas
I thought you meant like the Monty is occluding the object. The object is
no.
Well, in some sense, all sensors, if you don't move them, they can only sense one spot, right? So and then there's movement to sense more spots, and some sensors are harder to move and take more time than others, but they're all basically the same, right? I mean, your finger can't touch the front and the back at the same time. It has to move, and neither can your eye. So it's not a strong distinction in my mind. It's a
and then but that distance, that separating space, of course, if an agent is in some sort of potentially hazardous environment, or it could be a very simple hazard, just like if you're moving around an object, you risk knocking into it, you risk kind of disturbing it, things like that. The distant agent has a much simpler kind of actuation space, because it just kind of moves as it chooses, and it doesn't really interfere with the environment or put itself at risk. But of course, that also has its limitations. So you're limited to essentially air propagating modalities of information and sensing, whether that's electromagnetic radiation or sound. And of course, if you're kind of separated by that space, then you also can't directly manipulate it. And I'll just keep going through this stuff, but obviously ask any questions or stop me if anyone has any comments. With the surface agent, again, it's intuitive to think of it as something like a finger, but maybe a robotic finger where you could add things like a camera to it. So you still have essentially all the modalities that are available to the distant agent, and then you also unlock some like texture, which require touch, or you can imagine having more sensitive ways of measuring depth and temperature and things like that, given the proximity. And of course, by being next to the object, you have the ability to manipulate it. But in general, that does lead to a much more kind of constrained, complex movement kind of space, and you can't just arbitrarily move around. Then you start colliding with objects, and so that needs to be much more deliberate and thought out. And even the kind of limb or whatever system is supporting the surface agent tends to be more complex than just like a ball and socket kind of system for something like an eye. And then of course it's worth saying that eventually these things should work together. As I kind of mentioned earlier, you can imagine a distant agent getting a quick overview of a scene, quickly kind of parsing the information there, and then using the surface agent to both kind of get more detailed information as necessary, reduce things like occlusion, and then potentially affect changes in the world.
I'll say it again, it seems to me that these agents are, from a practical point of view, you can think of them differently, but from a theoretical point of view, they're just points on a spectrum. Even like touch is interesting, because sometimes I've experimented with touching something with holding a stick in your hand, and what can you do with that? And so that's sort of a touch at a distance, and if you manipulate something with a tool like a screwdriver or a pen or something like that, that's also like sort of touch at a distance. And so there seems to be this spectrum of proximity and distance, difficulty moving, what you can sense, what you can't sense, but somehow they're all on a spectrum to me. It's
it's also not like the only two possible agents. I mean, these are just two possible action spaces you could have. And other people might have like a car, and the action space there is like acceleration and steering the wheel. So it's definitely not like these are the two only options. It's just
right. And so it seems, it seems, you know, what we really ultimately be shooting for is sort of an uber understanding of action policies that are sort of, okay, there's a spectrum of things here. Cortical columns all work the same way, and on this particular set of parameters, it's going to look like a surface agent or a distance agent. But somehow there's a common theory here, because humans and other animals are extremely flexible about what sensors are and how they move them, and different ways of doing things. So it just seems like it's not really a hard differentiation.
Yeah.
Said my point.
No, it's a good point. Yeah, worth emphasizing. Yeah, and so then we also have kind of types of policies that we've implemented, and again, trying to kind of come up with some classification. There's kind of maybe three broad types. There's kind of utility policies we have. These can kind of be thought of as experimental tools that they're not really what the model is doing in any kind of sense of intelligence or anything. It's more something we enforce on the model in terms of how it moves for some kind of experimental purpose. And then there's input-driven, kind of just low-level sensory information-driven policies. You can think of these kind of like reflexes. And then there's learning module-driven policies, which are more kind of concept of kind of model-based reinforcement learning, where there's kind of a model of the world used to drive action.
I think the latter two seem to be like the big two, right? But you know, input
for sure. The reason I'm just talking about this one is because, this is the one I was kind of alluding to earlier when I said I don't know if we've actually talked about it this much in meetings
before. Yeah,
but
never heard of it.
I think for that reason it kind of potentially causes confusion, and people are kind of like, "What's this?" and "Why does this here?" and things like that.
Okay.
So
good. So
but it's not something that exists in the brain for sure.
Okay, so the input one is interesting because it's basically anything that's not cortical, because there are subcortical structures that also initiate movement, and reflexes is one form of them, right? I mean, the reflexes have a sensory input, and then there's a neural system that moves the body. So there's really there's things that the cortex controls, and there's things that the cortex doesn't control, and it finds out about. You know, is, oh, I guess I moved, you know, and that could be like you know, hitting your knee and having to do a reflex reaction, but it could also be the cerebellum, you know, deciding to do something. You know,
I was torn about this use of the word reflexes, because I don't mean it in like a strict neuroscience sense. I mean it more in the colloquial sense of like,
I would call it. It's basically learning model driven and non-learning model driven, because either the cortex initiates it, or the cortex, someone else does for whatever reason, the cortex finds out about it and has to go, okay, what do I do about this?
In that latter case, it's like just part of the environment almost.
Well, to the cortex it is in some sense. It's it's funny how often. Go ahead.
Oh no, you go ahead.
There's a lot of research that shows that when a behavior occurs that the cortex didn't initiate, the cortex will still think it did it. It'll say, "Oh, I must have." You know, you're mentally, you're not the cortex, but you as a human will say, "Oh, I must have meant to do this because, you know, because I did it." And in reality, that the person had no conscious knowledge that they did anything. So it was either imposed upon the body or some subcortical thing did it, but they'll make up a story like, "Oh, I guess I really wanted to move my leg like that," you know, but it's not true. So the cortex looks at something and says, "Well, how did this happen?" And maybe I did it. It's just interesting observation. That's all.
Yeah, and I guess in the reinforcement learning terminology, it would be like model-based versus model-free policies, where with the input-driven ones, you don't really need a model of an object to decide how to act. And then also what we have right now, like one of the input-driven policies, for example, is to follow principal curvature, which is like basically we're just looking at the sensory input. How does the curvature look like? And then we just follow that. And that's, for example, something where the learning module might say, like, it might be aware that we're doing this policy right now. It might say, okay, I don't have a good hypothesis right now, so let's just follow the curvature. But we're not using the models inside the learning module.
Right, or it could be that's something that's done by the cerebellum or something, right?
Yeah.
The cerebellum just says, the cerebellum says, "Oh, I'm on a surface. I move along the edge." You know.
Yeah, yeah. So we don't need the cortical columns or learning modules for it, but it's not necessarily only reflexes. It might still be like some separate movement.
Right. That's what I was trying to get at.
And I guess that's why
form of that.
I also kind of tried to avoid the model free versus model based, because I was thinking, based on the models that we develop, that we have access to in the learning modules, I think we will probably use some model free type elements, in there eventually, as in like kind of just learn shortcuts. You can imagine kind of, you could slowly kind of think through like a learned graph, or you could kind of have some heuristics that I've learned that kind of still leverage that, but kind of combine the two.
Right.
But yeah. So it's hard to,
and I think
again, everything's kind of on a bit on the spectrum, but
on this non-learning
categorize.
module driven motions, we have free reign to do whatever hell we want there. We're not constrained to biology, we're not constrained to different types of, whatever works is good enough for me at least. Because these are sort of biological hacks that the body has come up with to figure out reflexes and even something like I've mentioned many times, when you're walking, how you place your feet and how you balance it and all that stuff. That's none of that's the cortex. And so we shouldn't try to burden the cortex with things that it really can't do or not very good at. So we can do anything we want for these input-driven non-learning module policies.
Right. Well, so yeah, I guess it's just a bit more kind of clarity on that. But as we were just kind of saying, so input driven, this is where the decision is going to be based on kind of external information essentially alone. Yeah, the learning modules might still be kind of inhibiting or disinhibiting kind of these policies in some sense, but the information that's necessary to make a decision about what to do is just based on kind of external information coming in, and these are generally kind of quick, simple rules. Whereas if it's learning module driven, then it's some level based on internal kind of learned models, and it's generally going to be a more complex, methodical kind of deliberation that's determining the action.
Good question.
Yeah.
External relative to what? Are we talking about the cortex? Because it could be internal, machine status, which was internal to the machine, but not external to the environment.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I meant it here as like external to the like meta agent, in the sense that it's since a lot of these are being driven by kind of subcortical structures and things like that.
Well, I think that's the question. I think you're saying external could mean subcortical structures, right? It's other parts of the brain can be doing this. It doesn't have to be, outside of the body.
Homeostatic mechanisms, for example, that are outside of the cortex.
Right. Or that's like I talked about walking. Walking turns out to be a very complex process. It's not too terribly, well, maybe it is simple, I don't know. But there's a motion generator, action policies for walking and balancing that aren't cortex, but they're not like, you don't walk because your knee was poked, So I interpret external the cortex.
Sounds good, thank you.
But it's your presentation.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I mean, I feel like it could be either. The reason I'm just emphasizing external to subcortical and cortex is just, yeah, if we're imagining that most of these policies are implemented in subcortical structures, then obviously the information they're receiving is external to them. But it could be from other parts of the body.
Right.
And then, what the policy is actually aiming to do. So, it can be inference focused, and that's most of the policies we have at the moment. It can be kind of focused on learning exploration, and then kind of not put here, but obviously it can be focused on, changing the state of the world. And so, yeah, most of the ones I'll talk about kind of fall in this camp, and I'll kind of emphasize if they happen to be more the second one. Cool. So yeah, with that, then I will get onto the utility policies, the first one. So yeah, I guess the best way to think of this is it's kind of a policy that's in some sense independent of the Monty system in terms of kind of the intelligence of the Monty system. It's there in our code base, in our kind of setup as a tool for the kind of scientist researcher to study Monty's capabilities and debug it and all this kind of stuff.
And they're usually called in the pre-episode function. So before any information is sent to the learning modules, it's just kind of a setup utility to get the environment into the state that we want it to be in.
Yeah.
I'm confused then. I mean, I thought the utility policies would include like just how to move your finger around the object or something like that.
No, yeah, it's even more kind of meta than that or something. It's like, how do we it's almost like, yeah, imagine you're doing an experiment with a mouse in a lab. You know, the scientist is first going to move the mouse into the correct cage before the experiment starts. And you know, we can't just leave it to the mouse to kind of jump around the cages and things like that. But the mouse is a physical entity in space. And so kind of in the same sense, like as soon as Monty is instantiated in a simulated world, it needs to move to a particular location, and that's something we want to enforce on it. But it's not really something that Monty kind of is thinking about.
Well, it's funny to call it a policy then. It's sort of a...
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, maybe that's a remnant of the way it's implemented in the code, but yeah, in general, it would be nice to disentangle it more.
Right,
so,
because I take the word policy as this is how our system is behaving, and not how me putting the mouse on the wheel.
Yeah, I think we call it that because we use the agent's action space to move to the correct location to start it. But we shouldn't confuse it with the actual policies that the agent uses during an experiment.
Right.
Yeah, and there's ways we could improve that. And we can talk about this later. I mean, it's kind of getting into the weeds, but like, yeah, at the moment we're kind of getting the agent to shuffle forward, for example, until it satisfies some criteria. But we could very much use a more external action space where we just kind of set the position of the agent and things like that.
All right. Well, I
required.
think just be careful of the word policy. And use it as most people think of it, I guess. Okay.
So yeah, as well as Vivian was pointing out, that generally these are called in the pre-episode, kind of before information is sent to the system. They generally make use of the kind of viewfinder, which is I'll kind of show on the next slide, but you know, that's sensory information that's typically, or that isn't sent to the learning modules. And they also make use of this semantic sensor, which is a kind of feature in Habitat that basically tells you kind of the ground truth of what you're looking at. You know, you're looking at X object as opposed to a blank wall or the vacuum of space or something else. So this is kind of privileged information that we're generally not, or kind of trying to avoid giving to the Monty system. And there's two main ones: get good view, which is used by the distant agent, and touch object, which is used by the surface agent. So yeah, this will be familiar to most, but just as a reminder, kind of the viewfinder is this, if you have something like the distant agent, it's this zoomed out view of the scene and what's kind of visible. And then there's the kind of zoomed in small kind of straw world view of the objects and sensory information coming in. This is what's actually sent to learning modules and what's used to build up models of the world. This is here, again, as really a tool for the experimenter who's working in Monty, if you either want to debug things or just understand the performance of the system. But we can also use this viewfinder, I said, for these kind of utility functions. And so get good view, which is used by the distant agent, essentially just tries to kind of move forward while kind of facing the target object until you have kind of a majority of pixels in this viewfinder on the object, as opposed to kind of empty space. But then that's kind of conditioned on not getting too close to the object. And yeah, for this, it kind of makes use of the viewfinder and the semantic sensor. And the kind of end effect of that, so you can see kind of, this is an example of where at the start, or sorry, this is maybe a better example, these two, where at the start of a episode, we may be quite far from an object, but by moving forward, until you kind of have this good view where a significant portion of the input is filled by the object, then we ensure kind of a good starting point where we can make kind of small saccades over the object to explore its surface. And this is simpler to implement than kind of trying to kind of predetermine exactly where the agent can be, because then we risk, for example, starting inside the object and things like that. And then the touch object has a kind of similar core purpose. Ultimately, it's about getting the agent kind of to be sensing the kind of object of interest at the start of the episode. But because it's the surface agent, it's ultimately about getting it onto the surface, or in particular, it's a depth camera within kind of a short desired distance. And so this kind of image in profile is showing a mug where we have this is kind of representing the distant agent, and it begins the episode here, moves forward until it's touching the object. And then from that point forward, touch object has been satisfied. It then hands over to the kind of the more internal input-driven policies to then follow the surface and things like that.
Niels, what does the blue line and the red dot represent?
It's just meant to give like a sense of orientation. So you can imagine, maybe this is the base of the finger, and this is the finger itself.
I think
and so
what's odd about it is it seems like you would think the red dot would be where it's touching the object, and the blue would be just showing its orientation.
That's fair. Yeah, I guess
why.
I thought of it more as like a joint, but I could see that.
Oh, I see.
You think of it more as like the
Well, there's a red spot, like that's the spot, like you think the spot would be hitting
right.
something versus,
Yeah, right.
All right.
Yeah, does that make sense? Will?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. Okay. But yeah, this touch object is actually also used if the agent has fallen off the object, which does sometimes happen due to, I'll get more on the kind of touch agent or the surface agent later, but it can be a way of kind of reestablishing contact with the object if that's essentially lost. And overall, there's kind of some subtle differences, which I won't go into all of them, but only get good view actually makes use of the semantic sensor, but both use the viewfinder. Touch object can actually search for an object, even if it's not visible in the viewfinder. It will kind of look around everywhere in space, basically until it sees something, and then move towards that object. Whereas get good view basically assumes the experiment has been set up so that the target object is somewhere within the viewfinder field, and then it orients towards it. And then, as the name implies, in practice, the touch object tries to get closer, although that is defined by a parameter, whereas the distant agent tries to maintain like a minimum distance away from the object. But I would say that the distinction between these two, or the fact that they are implemented so separately, is probably a historical quirk of how these were kind of the time at which these were implemented in code and things like that. I think a very simple improvement that we could do, and something that would make the code much easier to understand, is to really consolidate these into a more kind of unified set of utility functions. And one thing we could do as part of that change is Scott shared some nice findings from a policy he's been experimenting with that is kind of an alternative to the get good view, to essentially kind of fill the input image with the desired object, but also not kind of clip it off at the edges, which currently sometimes happens. And then in general, to this whole discussion about kind of utility functions, utility policies, I think it'd be great if we actually separate out what is really kind of a utility from something a model can use, because as I mentioned, the touch agent currently uses the model to kind of, or the touch object to get back on the object if it loses it. That's really something that happens after the experiment has started. And similarly, for the learning module driven policies, which I'll touch on next week, the agent is generally kind of teleported to a location and then refines the object. That's currently using these. But we obviously want to limit the use of things like the semantic sensor once an experiment has started.
Just one note on the semantic sensor. As far as I remember, the get good view policy also has an option to do it without the semantic sensor, where we basically estimate the semantic information from the depth information.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And then, yeah, in which case the only place we'd kind of have to use it is in the, what you call it, like the multi-object setup. But I think in general, it's very fair to use it during like the pre-episode. There's nothing at all wrong with that. But then, yeah, to your point, we can just make sure that those, that we kind of separate that out and that we're only ever using the depth estimate when we do the, once the experiment has started. Yeah, were there any other questions? I remember, Tristan, yeah, you mentioned that you wanted to clarify some things about these policies. I don't know if that helped or.
Yeah, this is helpful. Thank you. The distinctions are useful for everybody to know when they look at the code.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wrote up some notes that I can also make sure we document somewhere because, yeah, I don't think there was really anything written up to clarify these differences.
Might be good to put those in the glossary as well.
Right. And then, yeah, so that's the kind of utility functions, utility policies. So now I'll talk about the input-driven ones. And what I was going to say, yeah, these kind of mentioned are defined by kind of using some sensory information to that's coming in to make our decision, but no kind of learned models of the world and things like that. And so we have kind of the base distant policy.
The spiral scan actually doesn't use any input, I think. It just...
Does it not do moving back?
I think, isn't that a separate policy, the move back? Maybe I'm forgetting. But
yeah, I was actually,
but yeah,
I was wondering about this.
Definitely not a model-based policy. So yeah, we can definitely put it into this bucket.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, it might be worthwhile revisiting all the language here, because even the learning module policies are input driven in some sense. I mean, it has to know where it is. It has to know how the object things are moving. I don't know. It feels like,
yeah. I mean, we used to call them the bottom up and top down policies.
Yeah.
And I think we would like that terminology. I still like the model based and model free terminology because that kind of emphasizes that the learning module was based on the learned models.
right.
But
I like that. I mean, I would think of it as cortical and non-cortical, or cortical and subcortical, something like that. In the brain, all policies are driven by neurons, right? I mean, the reflexes too. So I would think, oh, it's a cortex or it's non-cortex. But that's, you know, neuroscience. But I think just thinking about the language, because we're going to be living with this language for years. Everyone's going to have to go through this stuff. And, you know,
I mean, model free and model based is definitely more familiar. Maybe, I guess as long as we acknowledge that, model free can also exist within the cortex. But I guess there's nothing about saying model free here.
I'm not sure. Is that true? I don't know. Could model free?
Say so. I mean, I mean,
what would be a policy?
There's evidence that.
Give me an example.
I mean, just things like riding a bike and things like that. I mean, a lot of that exists within the cortex, doesn't it?
No, I think it's mostly basal ganglia and spinal cord and things like that. I mean, this is why, like, learning how to ride a bike, someone can't tell you how to do it.
Sure.
It's you know, the cortex. It's like you don't even know. Most people don't even have any idea how they balance a bike. It's intuitively weird. So I would argue that's an example of definitely non-cortical. That's it's like, you know, some basal ganglia or cerebellum or something like that. And I'll push back on that. You might be right, Niels. I don't know, but I would challenge that. The way I view the cortex is like the cortex doesn't really have any non-model based policies. It's I think all that other stuff, walking, riding bikes, balancing, reflexes, these are things that the body does and the other parts of the brain do, and
yeah,
cortex
I'm not sure why I'm remembering. Yeah, that, but I think it's, if I'm thinking of anything, it's just like supportive functions or something like that. So it's it's
well,
probably not really
it's a
relevant.
clean break if we could think about the cortical or the learning modules as being pure model-based systems, and they don't really have any other stuff to do with the world. Because all this other stuff is very, riding a bike, it's like, that's the strangest thing, to turn left, you first have to turn right. And people don't even know this. And so it's like, it's just stuff that happens outside and the cortex doesn't really understand it. And anyway, I would really think we should try to keep, we've got the learning modules, which are really pure model-based. And then there's a lot of other stuff, which is, I think you do a good job here pointing out there's these utility things we have to do, and then there's reflex things and other things that happen. But I would think all those are non-cortical. That's how I would think about it.
Yeah, I think I like us making that distinction, because that will make it easier also later as a rule of thumb. If you have a policy that doesn't require a model, try moving it outside of the learning module. And
right.
And
almost all those policies will be either modality specific or environment specific, or they're not general purpose, right? Right. I'm not super familiar with the words model free and model based. I know of them, so if there's a problem with that, they sound good to me. But I'm not advocating for those. But that basically does capture what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would say they are pretty good. And then I would only change it if we have a very concrete example where we would need a model-free policy inside of a learning module or a cortical column.
Right. In the brain, the one potential exception I can think of, and I mentioned this many times, is the extra layers in V1. We don't know what they're doing. And I've always speculated that they're trying to deal with this determining depth from it's from two eyes that are distance, and but that's the only place in the cortex where I can think of, oh yeah, there's some weird extra machinery here for vision. Everywhere else it looks kind of the same everywhere, so it's kind of this seems that there wouldn't be any non-model policies in the cortex.
Yeah.
Just to fly on, wouldn't model conflict with like deep learning models, like the actual weights of something? Just people
conflict what, in terms of language, in terms of confusing people?
Yeah. Like maybe calling it a learning module policy is much more explicit.
But we use the word models in Monty. I mean, learning modules learn models. I mean, that's inherent to our. I just
in some ways I think model-based is good in that, because that's an established term, and when people use it in reinforcement learning and things like that, they do generally mean kind of a similar thing to what we mean, which is you have some explicit model of the world, like for example, you're simulating the results of Go moves or something like that on like a kind of modeled board. It's not just like some implicit function.
Yeah, I agree. I think the way that it's used in reinforcement learning is pretty much what we mean here as well.
Yeah, every learning system has models, everyone, and they're just different types of models. We have a sensory model with locations and orientations, where deep learning doesn't have those attributes. It's different types of models. I think that's how I've been using it generally. It would be correct to say model. We just have to make sure that people understand that our models are different. The sensory motor models.
Cool. Well, I think this is only the third, maybe the fourth time we've changed the names for these things, but I think every time it's probably gotten more accurate and better. So it's probably a good thing, and maybe it's finally clear. Nice. Oh yes.
Just remember, thousands of people are going to be trying to learn this stuff, and if we spend some time now clearing it up, it'll make their life. It'll like the benefit to humanity will be great. So it's worth going through it. Probably tens of thousands of people will be trying to learn this stuff. So.
Really.
Can I was thinking about how to kind of like unify the distinction that we have for surface and distant, and also kind of these different policies like utility space. I'm just using the language from your slide. Utility space, like reflexes and learning module. And I mean, this was just going off from the utility space where we use like viewfinder to try to kind of orient ourselves towards the object, but maybe, and I think we were leaning towards maybe that's not, we shouldn't like call that a policy, but maybe we can even kind of apply to like flesh this idea. But we have an agent at different states, so it's in like a searching mode or like a navigating mode or exploring mode, and I guess exploring would really depend on the kind of sensory or whatever kind of actuators you have. But I like the current way that we try to use viewfinder would be when the agent is at a searching mode, and hence it will try to plan out a path to get to the object. I don't know, or like maybe there's some policy. Maybe this is indeed a policy. It's just a policy at that searching mode. Or, like maybe we can think of like agents having finite states. I don't know very much about finite state machines, or but yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think searching is a good way of describing it, and then I guess the one thing is like we could have searching policies that fall under kind of model free, where it's like it's the agent that's just using the information coming into it. So basically like sensor patches, and it's using that to kind of look for something. I feel like there's still a risk, like, or like, I think we should ultimately still separate those out, and just make sure that like, if we are using this kind of privileged stuff, like in general, we don't want the viewfinder kind of anywhere in Monty in the long term.
That's
and also
the main thing, that we don't want to use this privileged information during an experiment. So I mean, we could say, oh, we have a sensor in the periphery that gets like a larger receptive field at low resolution, and then we might have that connected to a learning module as well. But right now, they are getting information that isn't given to them during the experiment, and we don't want them to get during the experiment. So that's kind of the distinction in my mind. But we do have these kind of states, like we have the matching phase and then the exploration phase, for example. That goes kind of into the direction, Tristan, that you were interested in, like what's the direction we want the code to change. And I think in the future, we do want it to be so that the agent can actively switch between different policies, and pretty much the learning module would say, oh, I recognize the object now. Now I want to use my exploration policy and learn more about the object. And that could even be model-based. It could say, oh, my model doesn't know much about this part of the object, so let's move over here. Or it could be model-free. Oh, I just want to scan over the whole object with a spiral.
There's a lot of literature about both from the biology and machine learning, I guess, but in biology too, about we do have these sort of overall modes of, hey, if you only want to explore when you're comfortable, you're in a safe environment, you're not at risk. And so there are these sort of emotional states we can go through between, like, yeah, okay, I'm willing to explore, which is inherently a dangerous thing, right? If you're exploring, you might trip up and hit something bad. So I think the idea you could have this sort of overall, like the whole system is in an exploration phase now, the whole system is trying to like just infer, or the whole system is trying to deal with something that's happening that's unexpected. I think that would be a reasonable thing to do, because it looks like biology does that.
Yeah. No, I think this kind of stuff.
And if you think about it, maybe in a deployed system, you might have deployed systems that do no exploration, right? They're just like, hey, we've trained the system. It's now, we want them all to work the same in some sense, and don't go off and try to do something on your own.
If you've got multiple sensors and actuators, does the whole system have to be in explore mode or hungry mode? I'm just thinking, as I'm a perpetual fiddler, so I'm sitting here fiddling and listening.
Yeah, so
I can say I'm exploring this object, and I don't know what listening is, but
That's interesting. I've asked myself this question about, like, there's these behaviors that I do, you call it fiddling, where people flip a pen in their hand. I clip, I will put the top of a pen off and on, off and on. And I wonder, is that really cortex, or is that, because often you're not even aware that you're doing it. You're not thinking about it. It's just sort of off on the side happening. You're tapping your foot. I don't know. Even like if you scratch an itch, that's usually not the cortex, right? So I think I've always sort of thrown the fiddling, scratch the itch, tap your foot off into some cortical thing. The cortex is not involved in that at all. That's what I've thought about it. Of course, the cortex can observe it and say, "Oh, look, I'm tapping my foot or I'm scratching my back." But the policy to implement the scratch is probably not.
Yeah, and I guess maybe in general you can have like one subcortical and one cortical going at a time. Like you can be thinking about something while brushing your teeth, something, but it's hard to
Right.
but you can switch between with like short windows.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I would say my fiddling is constructive. I build little things. So I think I'm giving it some attention.
All right, maybe, yeah. Or here's another example. You're driving a car, right? And while you're driving a car, you are talking to someone. That talking to someone can be very exploratory. You can be trying to understand what they're talking about. You might be visualizing things. You might be probing them. And yet driving the car, clearly, there's a lot of that is cortical, right? Almost, the vast majority of it is, a lot of it is. So there's I guess an example where you have one modality that's definitely cortically driven, model-based, control, goal-oriented, and then another part of the cortex is exploring. So I guess you could have both.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that the other day. Like when you're driving a car, your eyes are saccading all the time. You're recognizing all these objects and where they are and how they're moving. You're also steering the car, and still you can like listen to a podcast and in your head have all these abstract concepts and think about all these, a completely different scene in your head. It's like
unless something happens visually unexpected, or something happens unexpected to the car, then you immediately stop thinking about the podcast. And your attention is completely focused on the car situation. One way I've kind of thought about this is that, we have these many levels of the hierarchy in the cortex, and things that are really practiced can be learned at lower levels. And therefore, they don't require the upper levels of the cortex to pay attention to them. You don't have to, like when you're driving your car, you don't really form episodic memories of, the car that was next to you one moment and the next car that next to you in another moment, things like that. It all just gets washed away. So a lot can be happening on these. And if you think about a big hierarchy, imagine that some part of the lower level of the hierarchy is driving the car, but the other part that's thinking about the podcast is going all the way up to the hippocampus, and you're forming episodic memories about it, and that's where your sort of mental focus is. Where the other stuff is just on autopilot until something bad happens or unexpected happens, then it flies right to the top of the stack and says, "Let's deal with this issue." So I'm just sharing sort of personal observations that may have some value.
Yeah, and then just in terms of Monty, to wrap it up, because Niels, I don't want to take over the whole.
No, that's fine.
Presentation, but like right now, we have it implemented so that there's always just one agent, and it might have multiple sensors attached to it. But in the future, we want to be able to have multiple agents that move independently of each other, like multiple fingers that are moving, or like two hands moving. And each agent could have its own policy, and each agent might change its policy at different points in time. So we want to have that kind of modular flexibility.
Right. We can start simple here, right? But ultimately, we want to get to the point where we have, agents that are like humans, and then being able to do things and think about other things at the same time. We'll get there. Right. So it can be confusing because right at the moment, we just have to, can this finger recognize this coffee cup,
Yeah.
But it's not thinking about podcasts at the same time.
Cool. So yeah, just talking through the kind of model-free policies that we have at the moment. The kind of simplest one is for the distant policy, distant agent, sorry, where it's essentially just kind of making small saccades as like a random walk. And so this is kind of entirely, internally driven in a model-free way. I guess the only kind of sensory information coming in that can then influence this is if the system kind of goes off the object, it essentially just reverses the previous action.
And moving
And
the object is determined from the depth image. So we have some heuristics of like a sudden change in the
in depth, right?
Images.
And this is just kind of showing again, but in a different view where you see the mesh and then you see the kind of essentially points that are kind of centered or that are sensed rather on the object. And this just shows
almost
that
looks like a random walk, is it?
It is a random walk.
Is there a reason for that? Or is it we just want to make sure we cover enough? I mean, why wouldn't it just follow the line for a while?
This is the simplest policy. It
Okay.
builds up from here.
Okay.
But yeah, but what I'm trying to show here is that this is very inefficient.
Okay, yes, it looks like it. I agree.
But yeah, and you can add kind of some momentum to this random walk to kind of make it go, more in one direction for a while. But it's still a random walk. And then there's the spiral scans policy. This is the one that's essentially kind of learning only, really, or like it's entirely designed for learning. And this was a way to kind of ensure that we sampled points on an object densely. And so you can imagine it literally does this kind of square spiral going outwards across the surface of objects. And this is, again, the distant agent that does this. And then the base surface policy is one that kind of, touches the object and then moves along it while kind of always remaining oriented to the point normal. So I'll kind of show what that means in a moment, but you see that both here in terms of how the kind of finger follows the curvature of the object. Also, if you watch this video, as it gets kind of to the lip of the object, it kind of curves around and then follows the top.
That's really nice. Did you make those videos new for this presentation? I don't think I've ever seen them.
This is an old one, but yeah, I haven't shown it in a long time. It was way back when I was debugging some issue with the surface policy. But yeah, so just trying to understand this a bit better. So imagine you have this surface of the object in blue. We've kind of zoomed in, and then you have this finger touching it, and we start out kind of oriented with this point normal. It's a recursive or iterative algorithm, but just for the purpose of this, kind of we start there, and then to kind of follow the surface, basically take a kind of tangential step perpendicular to this point normal, then move forward until we're touching the object, and then orient to be parallel with the point normal, and then repeat. But of course, I've shown these steps very large in order to make it easy to visualize. You can imagine if you kind of make these steps quite small, then that's essentially what your finger is doing as it kind of follows the surface.
Got it. So it doesn't actually, it's interesting because I was thinking, well, I wouldn't actually remove my finger from the surface, but
right.
I think I would sense that the pressure is reduced.
Right.
Therefore, I have to move in a certain direction to keep a constant pressure, which is essentially the integration of what you're showing here. So
exactly, yeah. So as the kind of distance becomes extremely small, then it kind of
and also becomes... only every fourth observation is sent to the learning module, so only the ones after the reorientation, right?
Yeah. So kind of again with the whole kind of like subcortical, like it's only some. Yeah, there's a few filters, I guess, before it gets to the cortex. But one of them is just that, like, a lot of this is just the kind of finger kind of orienting itself, and that's not information that needs to be sent.
So this idea that the finger is sort of following the surface and automatically adjusting the, its depth to stay on the surface, I can imagine that's all subcortical. I mean, the cortex could say move in this direction. But but what actually happens in the actual movements and would be reported back to the cortex, as opposed to the cortex saying, "Oh, I'm following a curve." It would be more like, "Oh, I moved in this direction, and it looks like it's curved," as opposed to like it knows what's going on. This kind of micro adjustment that's happening here is almost certainly not cortex.
Right. Yeah, and in our system, it's not. It is a model-free sub LM system.
Yep. Great.
The surface point normal is estimated by the sensor?
Yes, yeah.
And the sensor module, so the sensor module gets the depth image and then estimates the point normals.
Okay.
Back to your question earlier, Vivian, about we only send every fourth point or something like that. That's not today's talk, but that is a major topic for us. Is in the cortex, it feels like I made this argument many times. The cortex can learn all those points. It doesn't really take any more memory. Whereas where we're doing it now with discrete points, it does take more memory. So that's a sort of an elephant in the room. I'll have to deal with.
So we have another thing, which I'm not talking about because it's not really policy, but it's like the feature change sensor module. And that's more of kind of like a buffer or whatever that like
it determines how far you have to go before it's trying to be efficient.
And that's both in physical space and in perceptual space.
Yeah, I think cortex does the
like
miraculously. The cortex, you could train on different points, and anyway. We talked about this before. It's potentially a looming problem. I don't know, but we'll deal with it. Maybe you already dealt with it. Okay, sorry. Keep quiet.
No, sorry. But as it currently, stands, this will follow the surface of the object, but it's still a random walk in terms of the kind of directions that we are moving tangentially. I mean, either it's an entirely random walk or you add some momentum factor and then you get these kinds of curves. But at this point, there's nothing to kind of follow the significant curves of an object itself, which is what this follow-up policy then implemented, which is called the curvature-informed surface policy. And so this was designed to follow the minimal and maximal principal curvatures on objects, which is kind of what you see here in yellow, where it's first following the maximal, then the minimal, then still the minimal curvature. Or you can imagine the same if it was moving along the handle. So this was trying to get a policy that would intuitively kind of capture the idea that just instinctively our fingers will tend to move over these kinds of curves when sensing an object, rather than just kind of moving randomly all over the surface. And just as a reminder, so the principal curvature at any point on kind of a 2D surface, these are the orthogonal points of maximal and minimal curvature, either they're flat or negative. So this provides us kind of with two directions that we could go. One in which kind of there'll be a minimum amount of change, and one in which there'll be a kind of maximum amount of change. And so in effect, this can.
It also just occurred to me, by the way, it occurred to me this could be related to how we learn the orientation of the object, right? In some sense, those two things, maximum curvature and maximal flatness, could almost always align with how we overall for an object, how we orient it. Like I don't learn the cup at some 30-degree angle. I tend to learn it where the vertical surfaces are flat and going straight up and down, and the curvy ones are. I just think somehow it's related also to the orientation.
No, for sure. I think and in general, I think it's like the kind of, it's almost like the principal axes of the object.
Right. That's the way to put it.
I think Biederman kind of had these theories around how we kind of represent those, but yeah, that's how you can kind of derive them from sensory information.
Right.
But yeah, this is just showing what this can kind of generally give you, which is you follow the kind of side of a cup and then go around the rim when you reach that, and then this is just showing against the finger as a kind of stick moving along it. And as you see, we're still orienting to be perpendicular to the point normal, which is more noisy or more kind of rapidly changing in somewhere like the rim of a cup. So that's why it's going around like that. But and then just kind of going into a bit more detail in general, this policy tries to alternate following the minimum curvature and following the maximum curvature, and then sometimes just not following either, because if we just keep on one forever, we risk just doing kind of a loop on the object. And then similarly, if which go often these are undefined. This is something where I'd argue that this is kind of a hack, because at this point it's this was like fully model free, fully input driven, whatever. And so this was a way kind of preventing us from just kind of repeating ourselves endlessly. I think the natural way to resolve this is to have still this kind of same principle, but then there would be more of a kind of model based knowledge of like, okay, well, I'm returning to the point that I was at before. Let me explore in some other direction. And then that would be more of a top-down signal.
That sounds right.
But yeah, this was to get it kind of working in practice. And so, so this is just showing, for example, there's a lot of places where to the human eye, well, not here because this is perfectly flat. So that's why there's no kind of defined principal curvature directions. But there's a lot of points like here where to the human eye, you'd think, okay, well, it looks like the principal curvature direction should be defined. There's the minimal curvature around the edge, the side of the bowl, and then the maximum curvature here. But that due to noise in the kind of point clouds and how it's estimated and things like that, often it's not actually present to our sensors. But still, you see here kind of it takes like a kind of random path with some momentum, gets to this kind of small edge on the bowl, it follows that for a while, then it kind of goes in this direction for a while.
Yeah, and just in terms of like future Monty work or plans, this is a great example of where we would ideally want these to be 3 separate policies and then have the learning module be able to
switch between them, right?
And right now we just kind of have hard-coded random switches between them or triggered.
Right, I was thinking, it's a good point. I was thinking like, oh, I would probably follow the white curvature all the way around. And mentally is what I would probably do. And then I said, oh, now I'm back to where I was. Let's go in a different direction, which would be a changing direction based on the model I've just learned, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Or may already even know. Yeah.
Right. Well, if I haven't, assuming I'm learning this thing, if I have previously learned this and I'm just doing inference, I might follow the curvature until I have an hypothesis that I could test, like, oh, this could be the bowl, or it could be, the dinner plate, and now the best way is to head down the side to find out. But during learning, I don't, I might want to just follow just like imagine the coffee cup. I might want to follow the entire rim of the coffee cup if I've never learned this object before, and then okay, back to where I am now. Let's go another direction. All right, but anyway, what you've done is great.
I also was kind of thinking about like developing some kind of internal model of the general bounding space of an object. Like if I have some kind of, I might try, if I have an object like this, to imagine that there's like a sphere enclosing it, sort of, and I might want to try to go around the object in such a way that kind of captures all the angles around it. And then in this way, I can kind of like develop some sense of the overall boundary of the object.
But I mean, that's what we're doing, isn't it? I mean, that's what the model is mostly, isn't it? It's got
it's moving along curvature.
But it's defining the morphology of the object, right? That's the goal here in some sense.
I'm suggesting like not actually following the curvature, but following, like if I had a sphere that was projecting a line that just did this, like a sphere with like long, I don't know how to put this. Basically, I'm trying to find the exterior boundaries of the object, regardless of the curvature.
But so I guess this would kind of do that in 2 sweeps. So we would, with most objects at least, like a lot of, at least the man-made objects have kind of like, yeah, two directions. So like the one you were just holding, that Tim, I just think like if you found yourself kind of on the edge, then you would kind of go around that way. That would be minimal curvature on that side. And then you'd be like, okay, well, I'm back where I was. And now the model base could kind of say, okay, switch, following maximum curvature, and then just keep going. And then you'd eventually do another circumference. If that's kind of what you mean?
Yeah, I guess. I'm trying to picture why I may or may not need curvatures to do that. Like I imagine that I could do this without following curvature.
I mean,
finding
yeah,
circumferences.
you can just do like a random, like with
Right,
momentum
just
kind of.
you could you could sample in any order you want, and you're going to end up learning the same morphological model either way. I guess we're just trying to do it efficiently. Is that?
Yeah, I think this was
mean-
inspired by just our own observation that when we touch an object and try to infer it, we usually follow like an edge or the rim of the cup, and those are usually the tasks of the minimum and maximum curvature.
And we don't want to do we want to do this intelligently because the random walk is very inefficient.
Yeah, and I think in general it is more efficient. Like imagine you're suddenly on the handle of the mug. Like if you're going to move in a random direction, that could be any direction. You could end up kind of doing this like weird spiral around the handle and just kind of go around and around and around. It makes much more sense if you just follow the minimal curvature and then you immediately get the general shape of the handle.
Yeah,
I think in general it is like a kind of to the whole point about like primary axes. Like with a lot of objects, if it's like some sort of ellipsoid or even a cylinder, like in general, following the minimal curvature will quickly get you from one pole to the next, and so kind of give you the overall shape of the object.
So yeah, I don't think Scott was suggesting a random policy, but from how I understood it, it sounds a bit like it would maybe be like a spiral scan policy for the touch agent that kind of scans around the object in like a sphere. And I mean that could definitely be like an efficient way to cover the entire object surface. It just doesn't seem very natural like what we would be doing.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's like you're walking into a 3D scanner.
Yeah.
And it's moving this scanning element around this sphere and measuring everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, we're ultimately, we can have all kinds of weird sensors that do things like that. That would all fit within Monty. But if we're trying to build embodied agents that actually move in the world, they're going to be constrained by physical movement issues. So from some implementations of sensory motor learning, we can do that sort of 3D scanner, but other ones we have to do this sort of action policy where you're moving sensors along surfaces.
Yeah, I was trying to imagine like if I pick up a brand new object, one of the things I want to find out first is what the spatial extents are of this object. And once I have some idea of the overall spatial extents of it, then I have more ideas about where I ought to explore next to fill in the particular.
Well, let's break that down a couple parts. At the most extreme, which is what we're doing here, you didn't pick up the object. You're touching it with one finger.
Right.
And that means you have to move everywhere to learn what this object is, and you can't, if I pick up an object and I've got hundreds of sensor patches on my hand that are touching the object simultaneously, and they know their relative. We don't know how to do this yet, but we know that the brain does this. They know their relative positions to each other, and so even a single grasp of a hand tells you a huge amount about the overall extent of the object.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Basically, this is like if we would have 5 learning modules that would touch all around the coffee mug. After just one sensation, they would vote with each other and immediately narrow down the hypotheses to the objects that have that size and shape. And you would immediately only have those few hypotheses, and you'd have the complete models of them. So then you could use those to inform the next movements. Like it doesn't have to be a separate process to estimate a bounding box or anything. It would just automatically come out of the like possible hypotheses given.
Imagine you grab this cup or any object with both hands, you have a really good idea of the boundary of the objects at that point. I mean, yeah, there could be something sticking out between two of your fingers that you didn't touch, but the interesting challenge here is that we have to develop Monty with this single learning module focus, which is very primitive and seems kind of wasteful, and it's very, we have to come up with all these things that Niels talking about. And ultimately, that's not the ultimate system. The ultimate system is going to have all these different learning modules working together. But we have to start here because this is the foundation. So I'm just reminding us, this is not where we want to be. This is where we're starting. Just like when you look at something with your retina, you're sensing different parts of the object instantly. Different parts of the retina are detecting the edges of that object, and you immediately have a sense of its boundaries with one glance. But if you're looking at it through a straw, then you have to move all of it, just like here. Same thing.
Yeah, and I guess just one other thing to add. I feel one other kind of potentially useful thing about this kind of heuristic is just in terms of sort of sub-objects or sub-features that I think in general you're more likely to kind of efficiently find those. Like, again, something that people will often kind of sense that might give them, tell them whether they're kind of sensing a mug or a can or something else like that is like the rim of an object. And again, if you're kind of moving along and then you encounter the rim, in this case, you're going to then kind of follow it for a period of time and get some sense of it. If you're kind of just doing like just like a general sweep across the object, then it's just kind of, you kind of bump into each feature, but you don't really get a chance to explore each one as you kind of go on the way.
Yeah, and that I think what you're bumping up against here is that this is also a single learning module in the sense that there's no hierarchy here. Therefore, there's no object composition at this point. It's just a bunch of features at locations. Whereas in the coffee cup has always been a difficult question, like, oh, well, what are the components? Is it just a single level, object, or is there compositional components? Clearly, at some point in our lives, handles and rims become compositional components, so do vessels and cup cylinders and things like that. But we're not even dealing with that right now. We're just dealing with just some morphological shape that has no subcomponents yet, and we're just trying to learn its morphology and what features exist at different points.
And because I kind of went down a line of thinking where if a cup wasn't a single object but compositional, then you've got multiple surfaces. You could have a model for each surface or distinct cluster of things, like a rim would be a model on its own.
Yeah, it's not clear. It's right.
Then
it's not clear.
Could you drive your exploration policies based on predictions on those submodules? Like if I see a piece of a rim, then I could instantly sort of predict what I'm going to see around it.
Right. Let's jump to something which is really clear. Let's say I draw a picture of a face and you got two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Right. Sure. Well, each of those is a clearly identifiable sub-object. And so now I'm saying, oh, well, if I see an eye and a nose, I should predict where the other eye should be or where the mouth should be.
And I can go check for it.
Right. Those are really clear. The coffee cup is a very unclear, what are its subcomponents? And it's just always been a problematic one for us to think about. So at the moment we're avoiding it in Niels' presentation right here. But ultimately, many, many things in the world are almost the vast majority of what we deal with the world when we're learning new things is we are recognizing objects we already know and doing compositional structure. That's like 99% of what we do day to day, moment to moment. This is more like a child just starting to touch the world and learn shapes and things. So we're avoiding that. I think we're avoiding that issue with the coffee cup right now. It's too hard to think about.
Is it too big a thing to avoid?
Well,
no,
it seems pretty important. Sorry,
no,
maybe I'm going down a rabbit hole.
No, we're not avoiding. In fact, the paper that I'm supposedly writing with Niels and Vivian is all about compositional structure and how it works, and I think it's extremely important. But on the other hand, a single learning module or a bunch of learning modules that are all at the same level, like in a single region, cannot learn compositional structure. And so we have to do both, right? We have to, so I think we're not avoiding it in terms of like, oh, we're gonna hide it. It's more like, okay, let's get these policies on a single learning module, down, because we have to understand that. And then we can also talk about how we do like the face and other kind of, truly compositional structures. And in my opinion, what will happen is we'll figure out ultimately that'll lead us to like, what do we do in the in-between spaces? Like, is a rim a separate object, or is the handle a separate object?
Yeah, and unfortunately, or like hopefully once we get time to it, like Vivian and I had some discussions at the last By the Bay for like how, at least in the current implementation of Monty, we could start adding in learning of kind of sub-objects like this. That should probably work pretty well. I can't remember, yeah, if we ever discuss that as like a broader group, but yeah.
My intuition would be if you started at the lower level, like of cylinders and rims, then your problem is simpler, like predicting a flat surface and having a policy that can explore a flat surface. Or is it easier to start from the bottom up, would be my intuition, I guess, rather than starting with complex objects and not having the learnings of bottom up pieces.
I think almost the opposite. I mean, I think what we're doing right here is really hard, and that's why we're having a lot of debate
I think
about
it maybe depends what you guys are meaning by simpler, as in like, I think it's true that it's more efficient if you have hierarchy, like in the same way that kind of voting makes inference more efficient. But I guess Jeff's point is he just wants to get it working first, like independent of like, because first we have to like learn the subcomponents and then put those together and stuff. So it's like, I guess getting the system before there's any subcomponents working. Like if it's a handle, then it's a handle.
System, like the communication and the
or like if the handle that's the lowest object, then it's a handle. But like how you get that system that understands the handle working in that case.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I'm just thinking like mugs don't form other objects easily, but if you started with planes and circles, it's a simpler, like they form other simple objects.
Well, I don't know. I could argue that mugs do form. We look at the table setting, right? You got a plate and a mug and a fork and a knife, whatever. That's a compositional structure where a mug is one of the components. I think, Michael, it's a fair criticism to say that it's easy. It's one sense we can easily say how we're going to learn the morphology of an object that's not compositional. That's what we're doing right here. Then we could say, oh, it's pretty easy to understand how we learn the composition of an object where the components are all pre-learned objects. And the hard part is the in-between ground. Like this mug, is a handle a separate object or not? And it's clear to me that when you start out in life, you don't know that handles are separate objects. And if a child is first time ever presented with a mug with a handle, it wouldn't say, oh, the handle is a separate object. It would learn it all at one thing. And then later on says, oh, this handles, I have similar handles on other objects, and therefore I'm going to somehow, separate out handles. And we don't really understand that yet, but there's this interplay between the levels and the hierarchy that let that happen. I'm just reiterating, this is the approach we've taken to break it into two parts. Start with a single learning module, then add multiple learning modules at the same level, and then do compositional structure at different levels.
Okay. We're definitely planning to look into hierarchy and make modeling compositional objects in the next months, and definitly a lot.
I mean, that seems, that's much more exciting. But I think if you jump to that now, you're just going to get it wrong. That's my opinion. We have to sort of understand the basics. That's my opinion.
Cool. So I guess one thing because kind of part of the intent of this presentation is to inform people who are using these policies. I just wanted to make sure I covered this point, even though this is something I'm hoping to change in the future. But with this curvature informed policy, it also has this kind of evasive maneuver step where it kind of keeps a trace roughly of where in space it's been recently. And if it feels like it's going back there, it basically kind of instead takes a step that's going to bring it away from it. This is clearly the kind of thing that would be much better implemented as like a model based policy, where it's the learning module that understands, okay, I'm starting to return to where I was before. I want to guide myself to go away from it, rather than the kind of subcortical structure keeping track of all that information. But again, this was the kind of hack to get this working well in the kind of current setup. But anyways, that's shown in here in green. So you can see here, like the system goes down here. It's kind of following along here, and then at this point, it starts following the maximal curvature in black. It's hard to see, but going up. But then it's going to just return to somewhere it's already been, and it can kind of tell that from a quick kind of check, and then so it turns around.
And you could imagine in other applications, the opposite policy might be useful. Like if we have very noisy path integration, we might actually want to revisit the same feature again to make sure we adjust our path integration.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because that's the only way you can really, ground yourself in the right location, is to go back someplace you've been or observe something you've seen already.
Right.
It's also like sort of any heuristic, there's going to be some object that it's going to fail horribly on. Like you can design a menacing object that will trap you in some pattern of your heuristic.
Yeah.
So that I think the learning part is needed. Like the model based part gets you away from that.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
We say model based. There's a whole other topic we haven't really delved in too much, which is the sort of the idea that the hippocampal complex is learning models, but it's more of an episodic memory. So if I were literally touching something for the first time and I was exploring it and I was thinking about it and concentrating about it, like, okay, we're moving over here. I'm imagining the hippocampal complex is sort of keeping a trace of where you've been. And it's just like, if you're wandering around an environment, it's going to keep a trace of where you've been. So whereas the models that's formed in V1 or S1 or something like that don't do that. So there's some complexities here where you could say episodic memory is sort of a temporary model. It's like saying, okay, I'm going to remember the actual path I just took, but it's not really part of the model that I want to ultimately learn. So it's the kind of the model I learned in the episodic memory of the hippocampus, which is a trace-based model, and exactly how did I get here? Where did I go? How did I turn? But the model we want to learn in the V1 or S1, or it's not like that at all. We don't want to have any memory of exactly how we learned the object or how we traced over it. So that's another complexity that is certainly going on in the brain. And we could think of this evasive, avoiding revisit. You could just throw that into like, oh, okay, there's a part of the cortex or part of the brain that's doing this. It's not.
Well, I guess I was thinking of it more as like short-term memory, which is kind of more of a, but that's a lot of like prefrontal cortex and
well, it could
like
be prefrontal. So, okay, fine. Whether it's prefrontal cortex or hippocampal, my point is it's not V1, right? It's not.
Right, but it might be hippocampus or prefrontal cortex or whatever, kind of like stabilizing some representations in V1.
Maybe.
Or,
I could be. You're right. I don't know. I viewed it more like episodic memories. Like,
yeah,
literally, if I was for the first time touching an object I've never touched before and trying to learn what it is, I would have the ability to mentally recall, oh, I was already over here and I need to go someplace else. I'd have that. And therefore I had some sort of short-term memory trace of where I've been, and whether that's prefrontal cortex or entorhinal cortex, I don't know. But I don't think that's what's going on in the lower level learning module. I don't think there's any evidence that there's just short-term memory in these things. Maybe there is, I don't know. So I think it's, again, this is in the gray area of like, okay, I think it's totally fine to have a policy like this.
right.
Just don't think that this is what all learning modules do.
Yeah.
It may be implemented in a different type of learning module or a different part of the brain, something like that.
Cool. And then, yeah, so just in terms of kind of how to improve this kind of some simple stuff. As mentioned, I prefer to kind of have this more as kind of kind of model based, because at the moment I'm storing locations and things like that in the code and everything associated with what's essentially subcortical motor systems. And then, yeah, as we were kind of talking about before, kind of model-based switching of the curvature guided policy. At the moment, if you look at the algorithm for this policy, it's really complicated, and I don't think it needs to be. It's just, this was kind of how I tried to kind of hack it together to be, to avoid a lot of the adversarial conditions. But to your point, Michael, like there's always going to be adversarial conditions that aren't satisfied. And so having more principled kind of model-based decision making would help with most of that. And then, yeah, I guess just a general kind of input-driven improvement that we've talked about for a while that we want to kind of implement is saccading to kind of salient features where, and this gets a little bit towards the kind of search policy as well that you were talking about, Jose. And I think, Scott, you were asking about this the other day, but basically the distant agent, it makes a lot of sense that we would have learning modules that perceive kind of the periphery with some low resolution. And then, based on some condition of kind of salient features, we can then orient towards something that's interesting. Yeah, so this has been on the kind of wish list to implement for a while. It would be nice to do.
Yeah, and that kind of points out, again, like these nice curvature following policies are all for the surface agent. So the distant agent is pretty random walks. So because with our eyes, we usually saccade from point to point. We don't really like do smooth pursuit and follow a curvature. So yeah, I think it would be very nice to find some efficient policies for the distant agent as well.
Yeah. Yeah, at the scale they're at the moment, the random walk is almost like microsaccades, just like your eye like drifting across an object. So not very efficient.
It's interesting if you were trying to learn something really foreign. So imagine I don't read Chinese characters, right? So when I see a Chinese character, printed character, they all kind of look similar to me. They don't jump out like they would to a native reader. And so if I wanted to try to recognize one of those characters, I would use very small movements of my eye. I would look at, okay, there's a little bar going this way, and oh, there's a little bar going this way. I would in some sense, I would go down to these. I'm not sure I wouldn't follow the curvature, but I would jump down to recognizing individual lines of that. Say this character has 20 different strokes in it, or 10 strokes in it. I would then attend to each of those strokes separately, because that's the object I can recognize. I can recognize a little line segment. That's the only thing I know. And so I guess I'm saying is, as you get with things that are less and less familiar, you end up getting closer and closer to following, even in vision, you get closer and closer to following the edges. You're not, but you're jumping to the lowest thing you can recognize. In that case, it would be just a line segment at some orientation and location relative to the character. So only when I learn to recognize the entire character with multiple points of my retina, then I can just jump around and saccade from character to character, or from whatever.
Yeah, I think with vision it's still usually that you jump from location to location versus this kind of smooth walk.
Yeah, right. You can, in fact, you cannot do smooth pursuit unless there's an object that's moving across the visual field, and then smooth pursuit is automatic. You have no mental ability to do smooth pursuit. If you try, it doesn't work. It only works. So I believe it's a superior colliculus thing where the cortex has no control over that. But my point is, it's not smooth pursuit, but it's also not jumping all over the place. In some sense, there's always the minimal thing I can recognize is always some edge or line section. That if I didn't have that, I couldn't possibly learn anything. So given, like, I use the Chinese character as an example of something which is basically just a bunch of little edges, and so I jump between those. because that's the thing I recognize. In some sense, I'm building a compositional object of little edges, little lines. Right. I'm just pointing, we keep going lower and lower and lower in smaller and smaller movements until we recognize something. And like in this figure, look at the windows across the street, those 4-paned windows across the street. Well, I recognize those windows, and so I can just glance at any one of them and I'll say, oh, that's a window. But if I've never seen a window before, then I would jump down and say, oh, well, there's this the vertical line, the horizontal line, and there's 4 of these little blue things, you know, whatever. You know what I'm saying? It's like, but now that once I know a window, I can just look at it and go, that's a window. I don't have to do it. But if you don't know what it is, then you're going to go deeper and deeper and deeper into it.
Yes, is this a good point to take a break? Because we're already over time a bit.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we'll stop here.